Business of Property podcast. I'm Simon. I've been investing in property for over 20 years, and if you're an active landlord or planning your next property investment, this podcast is for you. If you're willing and able to leave a rating or review in your podcast player of choice, I would very much appreciate it. I'm still experimenting a bit with the topics and conversations to bring you in this sort of updated and a newer format of the business of property. However, one thing I have learnt so far, and slightly to my own surprise, is that the last episode I recorded on my own, episode 231, has generated more comments and other messages generally than any other episode so far in the entire history of this podcast. So it got me thinking that perhaps I could request some specific comments and feedback on this episode, which is another one just with me. So what would you like to hear on the Business of Property podcast in the future? What would you like to cover? Please email show@thebusinessofproperty.com. Those emails will come through to me, and I would very much like to hear your suggestions. This could be in the form of questions, potentially, if you wanted. You could even record an audio clip on your phone and email that so that I could play it on a future episode. But alternatively, you could also just suggest topics that you'd like to hear, either things I could talk about myself or where I can ask an expert to be a guest. Speaking of guests, if there's anyone specific you would like to hear from and for me to have a conversation with on this podcast, please do let me know, and I can reach out to them and see if they would be interested. Again, that email address is show@thebusinessofproperty.com. Please do get in touch with your suggestions for future episodes. So on to the topic for today. I was listening to a recent podcast episode from another fairly popular property podcast from Property Hub, and they were talking about how they were managing £1 million property portfolios in under 60 minutes a month. And this got me thinking. Their sort of general approach was outsource as much as you can and pay for it to happen instead of doing it yourself. And that can be a perfectly valid solution in many situations to many problems, potentially. But I was thinking, what could you do if you sort of took this thinking of trying to optimize for time to its extreme, and perhaps without having the get out of jail free sort of approach of simply outsourcing it and swapping money for that effort and that time that would otherwise be used? So this episode is going to be me sort of exploring that idea and wondering what a £1 million property portfolio might look like if you really tried to approach it and optimize it for the amount of time that you put into it without outsourcing everything. I'm not entirely sure that every suggestion in this episode should really be followed, but certainly not strictly anyway. But I hope that some of these suggestions and some of these thoughts and ideas might give you something to think about, and maybe something that you could work on in the structure and design of your own property portfolio going forwards. I should also say up front that I do have another episode planned speaking about time saving and time optimization and working efficiently on managing your property portfolio. And that will be very much more sort of practical and specific, and taking examples from how I work in my own property portfolio to try and minimize the time that I put into it. Something that I do and have done for a long time, nearly 10 years in fact, is record how I spend my own time 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So I have a very good idea of the amount of time that I do put into looking after my own property portfolio, sort of alongside a day job, effectively building Patma and the software there. And I can tell you that at a very sort of simple level, just the sort of core management tasks of looking after the portfolio in the last 12 months, it's been less than 15 minutes per month. And this is a largely self-managed portfolio. So anyway, that's just a little teaser for another episode in the future. So getting back to this idea of a theoretical £1 million property portfolio that's really, really optimized for saving time. Now, one of the things that Property Hub mentioned was that buying properties takes quite a lot of time. You have to do lots of viewings and they're time consuming, and you have to do lots of maths and calculations to work out whether it's a good buy or not. And then if you do buy it, you might have to do some things to it to get it ready to rent and things. And their suggestion, of course, was that you would outsource this. But I think perhaps instead you should just buy fewer properties. Now, they were talking about a £1 million property portfolio. And of course, that could be made up of 10 properties worth £100,000 each. Or it could be made up of one property in London that's worth £1 million. And in London, that's actually not that unfeasible. In fact, if you go outside London to the southeast, you can definitely get £1 million portfolio in 2 family homes. So that is a massive time saving, a massive simplification straight away. So you're not potentially managing 10 properties and certainly not trying to work out how to buy 10 properties. All you've got to do is buy 1 or 2 and manage 1 or 2 properties. And yes, this may have an impact on sort of the financial side of things and the returns you might expect, but we're optimizing for time today, just time. So that's where we're really going to focus on. So we're going to buy a few properties, really not many at all. But what sort of properties should we buy and put into our hypothetical £1 million portfolio? So I would like to suggest that you should probably be looking at newer properties, but probably not brand new properties. Because while you think that buying a brand new property means you get a shiny new property that's absolutely perfect with nothing to do, I don't believe that's ever actually the case. In actual fact, when you take on a brand new property, you then have to go and do snagging on it. And if you don't, then those sort of initial little bits and pieces that are never quite right, not quite finished, etc., on a brand new property, will never get fixed. And that's definitely not what you want when you've got a brand new property and you've paid the premium for a brand new property. You don't want to have bits that aren't quite finished or quite right. So snagging can be very time consuming. And if you don't want to do it and put that time in, your tenants aren't going to do it. They're not going to do that for you. You could hire a professional snagger who can go around, yes, these people do exist, and put together the lists and feed it back to your builder and things. But again, it's more cost and it's outsourcing, which we're trying to avoid. So we definitely don't want to ignore it. It would be a job to do, and it would add extra time if you are buying brand new properties. However, once you've got past that snagging stage, fairly new properties should be a lot less maintenance, at least for some while. So I think you probably would be good to buy properties that are anything from a couple of years old up to, I don't know, 10 to 20 years old, maybe. Something in that region, in order to hit a fairly sweet spot of low amount of work that needs doing straight away, and also low ongoing maintenance effort requirements for that particular property. So then the question is, do you buy freehold or do you buy leasehold? And again, I think this may not be all that obvious, or what I think is the better answer to this may not be all that obvious. So you might think, well, obviously we're trying to avoid maintenance, we're trying to avoid ongoing effort and ongoing time to look after these properties. So obviously we'll go leasehold, where we've got someone else to look after the building and manage things for us and the maintenance for us. But I think actually a leasehold property is more likely to cause you sort of effort in the future, because there might be sort of shared areas in that building that you don't really have any control over. And of course, what happens if the lock on the front door breaks and your tenants are concerned about their Amazon parcels going missing or something? Well, then your tenant's going to bother you, but you can't actually do anything about it. This would be a simple phone call and a fix from a handyman or a locksmith or something, but you can't do it. Instead, you've got to try and contact the building management company. And in my experience with these such companies and talking to other people, that can often be very time consuming in itself. So while you're spending time trying to get hold of the management company and trying to convince them that there is a problem and convince them that they need to do something about it, and then waiting for that to happen, every week or two your tenant keeps bothering you and taking up more of your time to tell you that it still hasn't been fixed. Whereas if you had a freehold property where you've actually got control over these things and you're able to take the action straight away, yes, it requires you to put in that little bit of time when the tenant contacts you to actually contact a tradesperson and ask them to then liaise with your tenant and book a time and go and fix it. But that's it. Then you're done. And then you've got an invoice to pay later. I suppose a few more minutes there. But it should be resolved much more easily and much faster, with less time input from you as a landlord. And because we've chosen sort of newer properties, hopefully this also means that there won't be quite as much in the way of management sort of overhead from maintenance and issues cropping up. Because you're in a freehold, you're probably looking at sort of a house as well. So you haven't got a block of 10 flats or something with shared areas that are used by 10 households. The wear and tear on those sort of shared areas is also less. So again, less likely to have maintenance issues crop up in those areas that then need to be dealt with. So I think you should buy fewer properties. I think you should buy new-ish properties, but not brand new properties. And I think you should buy freehold properties in order to optimize the amount of time, or minimize, I should say, the amount of time you're putting into your property portfolio. But there are a couple more things that I want to mention as well. And of course, the property that you buy, you should also always be looking to buy a good property in a good area, simply because that combination will always generate less hassle on average. And you will generally get more reliable tenants in those sorts of properties and areas, and there will generally sort of be less maintenance on a well put together property in a good area that's attracted a good tenant who's going to look after it nicely for you. So good property in good areas is always a very important factor. Now, one more sort of, I think, interesting element that I'm going to throw into this mix is property finance. And depending on who you talk to and how sort of optimized they want to be for trying to get the best rates available and things, you might be looking at people who want to take on 5-year fixes or 2-year fixes, or maybe not fix yet because they think in 6 months' time they'll fix it then when the rates go down or whatever. But we're optimizing for time, and of course wondering about those things, trying to juggle the mortgage deal that you're on, and of course actually going through the mortgage application process. It all takes quite a lot of time. And you will, of course, have a broker that does a whole heap of that for you. But there will still be form filling and finding information and bringing things together and updating things. And it just takes time. So I think you should actually be looking at least fixing mortgages for 5 years, just because then you can forget about it. You don't have to take any more concern or time up out of your life to think about mortgages. And if you've got just 1 or 2 properties, if you put them on 5-year fixes, then that works out at not even half a remortgage each year. So hopefully that's a fairly small amount of time when that does crop up. But you could perhaps even go further than that and consider a tracker mortgage. And then you don't have to worry about it again for another 25 years, maybe. And you might say, tracker mortgages are ludicrously expensive, but I don't think they are, really. If you look at sort of the standard variable rates from mortgage companies at the moment, yes, they're crazy. They're sort of over 8%. But tracker mortgages, at least historically, I haven't checked with Simon Glastonbury recently whether this is still the case in the mortgage world, but historically, you could get tracker mortgages that were between 1 and 1.5% above base. So at the moment, that would be 6 point something percent, which is definitely higher than you'd be looking at getting a 5-year fix for. But from a financial point of view, you wouldn't keep having remortgaging fees every few years, every 5 years in this example. So maybe that wouldn't actually be too bad from a sort of monetary and cost point of view. And from a time point of view, it's brilliant. You only have to mortgage once every 25 years. So little time involved in actually managing that process and sorting that out. So I think my overall approach here is try and keep things as simple as you can. And maybe you can put together £1 million property portfolio where you don't have to delegate everything, you don't have to outsource everything, and yet you can still really, really minimize the amount of time that you have to put into that portfolio. So just to recap very quickly, I am suggesting buy fewer properties. You can build £1 million property portfolio with only 1 or maybe 2 properties if you buy them in the right place. And yes, there may be financial implications of that, but time-wise, the fewer properties you've got, the less time you're going to have to put into it. Buy new-ish properties, but not brand new properties, because there's a deceptive amount of time involved in buying brand new. Buy freehold, not leasehold, because again, leasehold, I think, is deceptive in the time input that you might need to have involved there. Buy good property in good areas. I think this one is always going to be very important, and it's definitely going to tie into sort of choosing that new-ish property as well as part of that. And then think carefully about the finance you want to have. If you can fix it and forget it for as long as possible, or track it and forget it for even longer, then you're going to be saving yourself a lot of time and effort on the mortgaging front. So I know this is a slightly contrarian approach to optimizing for time at the sort of expense of all else. And some of these points may well not be very practical from a financial point of view, or from a sort of trying to build your property portfolio quickly point of view. But then that is going to take more time if you want to build faster and have a property portfolio built up and sort of refinance to recycle money, or do any of the refurbishment side of things, or that kind of things to get better value out of the properties you're buying. That is always going to be a time investment. So if you really are just looking for a property portfolio that you can build gradually in the background without taking time, so that it's sat there ready, building value for your sort of retirement, your pension pot, if you like, then I think it might actually be worth seriously considering some of these points to try and keep things simple. So remember, in a future episode, I will talk a bit more about sort of practical side of actually managing a real property portfolio and minimizing the amount of time that costs without simply going to outsourcing everything. And I would really like to hear suggestions and ideas, questions, whatever it is that you would like to hear in future Business of Property episodes. Please do email me. You can reach me on show@thebusinessofproperty.com. And thank you very much for listening. I would love to hear your comments on this episode as well, and I will look forward to talking to you again next week.